This paper examines the growth of the medieval Irish cath or battle tale genre from the 12th through 14th centuries, in light of social and political changes during and following the Norman invasion and widespread church reforms in the 12th century. The period after the monastic reforms and the arrival of the Normans has often been seen as a bit of a culturally dead spot, while textual production was still shifting from the monastery to the courts of secular elites. Irish vernacular texts that were composed, rewritten, or recopied during this period have generally received less critical attention than their Old and Middle Irish counterparts. Today, I want to discuss two texts that date from the 13th and 14th centuries, and argue that not only can we see continuity over the period in terms of literary sources and interests, but that this was also a time of radical and original composition. I take as my case studies today the late 13th or early 14th century Caergrawnt, the Battle of Magdalena, and the 14th century historical epic Caergrawnt, the Triumphs of Tordelbach. The first half of my talk looks at the complicating, shifting perspectives in Caergrawnt, which is set in the pseudo-historical pre-Christian 2nd century CE. Part 2 of the talk today will untangle the relationship between the Middle Irish vernacular adaptation of Lucan's Civil War and Caergrawnt, which recounts a series of conflicts within living memory between the Hiberno-Norman family of de Clare and the O'Brien dynasty in northern Munster. I should just say that for anyone who read my abstract carefully and was hoping to hear about the Agaliv or the Crusades, you won't today because I ran out of space, but do come to the French of the Celtic Worlds conference in Bristol in April if you want to hear that paper. So to start with Caergrawnt, this text dates from either the late 13th or the early 14th century. It narrates the causes and events of the Battle of Magdalena, a pseudo-historical conflict said to have been fought between the forces of Owen More, King of Munster, and Con Cathach, Con of the Hundred Battles, the King of Tara and High King of Ireland, sometime in the pseudo-historical 2nd century. The text has been edited twice from two separate manuscripts, first by Eugene O'Curry in 1855, who took as his exemplar a manuscript in the Royal Irish Academy. Here, this is L2 on the stemma, and then later by Kenneth Jackson in 1938, who took as his exemplar a 16th century manuscript, Franciscan A6, which is in red here. And I don't want to dwell too much on the manuscript transmission today for reasons of time, but it is worth pointing out, you can see here, we've got a group 1 and a group 2 on Jackson's stemma, and the manuscripts edited in existing editions of this text belong to two separate groups and don't always line up all the way. So some of what I have to say today will remain a little bit tentative until more manuscript work can be done to establish what all actually separates these two groups. All right. Caergrawnt effectively links several narrative traditions together. These include the genealogical traditions of the Owenacht, in which their ancestor receives kingship in exchange for saving Ireland from a famine. So this narrative is found first in a text called De Bunadumthecta Ionachta, which has been variously dated from the 8th through the 10th century. In this text, the titular Owen originally comes from Spain and saves Ireland from a famine when he arrives. There's also a narrative about Owen's travels to Spain to find a Spanish wife in the Old Irish text Tocvarc Movera, the wooing of Movera. In addition to this Owenacht material, Caergrawnt also reflects a body of texts about Con of the Hundred Battles, found in an array of Old and Middle Irish sources. Finally, the fundamental premise of the text and the titular battle stems from an etiological tradition that at some point in prehistory, Ireland was divided into two halves, ruled by Con and Owen respectively. A northern half, Left Chun, and a southern half, Leth Voga, belonging to Con and Owen respectively. In the introduction to his edition of the text, Jackson writes that The compiler had genuinely to compile out of a loose body of legends of varying date belonging to the Owenach families, and the result is a composition rather unskillfully put together. Whether Comagulena is indeed unskillfully put together or not is a matter of debate. Jackson is correct that the work is a compilation in terms of the range of material that the author, or perhaps authors, probably knew and brought together. As Jackson himself points out, however, Comagulena is not listed in the older Irish tale lists, and while the first half of the text loosely follows the plot lines of existing narratives, no direct count of the battle itself survives from any earlier source, besides brief references to the date that it occurred in the annals and the synchronism tables. So while it is very possible that the author of Comagulena knew and used sources that are no longer extant to us today, it is also possible that they intentionally composed entirely new material, and it's hard to say which. Jackson's comment about lacking in skillful arrangement here may also be based on the fact that a striking narrative shift occurs halfway through the text, in which the narrative that is focused almost exclusively on Owen More and his good qualities so far suddenly changes course and takes Con's side for the rest of the story. As I will argue in the first half of my talk today, I believe that the text is structured in such a way as to make this sudden and surprising narrative shift an intentional device. I would argue that the text presents a far more skillful unity when viewed both as an original creative composition instead of a bad cut and paste job, and when considered in light of the Norman conquest. Okay. The plot of the first half of Comagulena runs roughly as follows. At the beginning of the text, there are 3 ruling dynasties in Munster. Owen More's father, Normaniaid, leads one of them. Owen's mother has a vision which is interpreted by the family druid as a warning of impending famine. Owen's family starts planning and stores up extra food ahead of time. During the famine, Owen's father agrees to share this food with the rest of Munster, provided they accept his son, Owen, as king of the entire province, and banish the sons of the other ruling dynasts, Conor and Macnead. The story of the famine is clearly informed by the genealogical narrative de Bunydd, although de Bunydd is much more succinct than Comagulena, and presents Owen and his dynasty as foreigners newly arrived. In Comagulena, Owen More is rather modest about the whole affair, and tries to refuse the title of king while his father is still alive. However, Macnead and the nobles of Munster insist. At this point, even though we haven't met Con yet, the text proleptically informs us that Owen More, great his qualities, as noble as Con of the 100 Battles. Despite the fact that no conflict has yet broken out between the 2 rulers, the poem provided here compares them as equals and anticipates further conflict and division to come. Meanwhile, the exiled Conor and Macnead, sons of the rival dynasts of Munster, have taken refuge with Con, High King of Ireland, and marry Con's daughters while they are at his court. This upsets Macnead, who refuses to submit to Con as a result, and the 2 go to war. Both Owen and the family druid try to prevent the battle, but to no avail. Macnead is killed in the ensuing conflict by Gol MacMorna, a character perhaps better known from Fenian tradition, and Owen attempts an ambush upon Con's troops, but is outnumbered. Owen duels with Gol, but is overwhelmed and must be rescued by his otherworldly lover, Adine, who substitutes a stone for Owen in the duel and spirits him away with her. Adine heals him and sends him to Spain for 9 years. While in exile in Spain, Owen woos and marries the king's daughter there. These adventures in Spain more or less follow the plot of the Old Irish narrative Táchfach Mac Mhaire. 9 years later, Owen returns to Ireland with Spanish reinforcements and reclaims his lands. Adine welcomes Owen and his army. She tells him the political lay of the land and states that she will confuse his enemies so that they do not realize he has returned. Owen defeats Conor and Macnead and takes hostages, before leading an island-wide revolt against Con. Con's councillors suggest that they give Owen half of Ireland, at least until such time as his foreign soldiers have gone home, at which point they can rise up and regain it. Con and Owen ultimately agree to divide Ireland in two between them. This peaceful state of affairs lasts for 15 years. While the tradition that Ireland was divided between Con and Owen can be found elsewhere, as I stated earlier, Cá Magdalena is our earliest surviving text to provide a detailed narrative for how it happens. In the earlier material represented by Dylanwad and Tábhacht Movera, Owen receives kingship without any actual violence taking place in the text, and the division of Ireland with Con is not narrated, although it is perhaps obliquely alluded to in a poem in Tábhacht Movera. We are now almost exactly halfway through Cá Magdalena. Owen, perhaps justifiably, worries that if his Spanish troops are allowed to leave, he will lose control of his half of Ireland. He decides that he has no choice but to break the truce. As regards the foreigners who came over with Owen, they were seized with great impatience and were desirous to return to Spain, and Owen sought a cause for breaking his truce with Con. The bit I've given you on the slide here is from O'Curry's edition and translation. It's a bit longer than what we have in Jackson, although the idea is the same. Owen's concerns may be well-founded, but the fact that he consciously looks for a way to break the truce with Con is the first sign that something is amiss. This does not seem like the behaviour of the Owen of the first half of the tale, who tried to turn down the kingship of Munster in favour of his father. Initially counselled against doing battle with Con, and, while in Spain, tried to refuse the hand of the King of Spain's daughter, on the grounds that he was a poor exile with no kingdom of his own. Nevertheless, at this point in the text, an argument breaks out over division of merchandise in Dublin harbour, and Owen uses this as an excuse to abandon the truce. Owen and his company march off to war, assured that the omens favour them. If the reader was not already tipped off that something was a bit wrong here by Owen's willful breaking of the truce, now the narrator makes it clear. After listing a series of astrological portents that Owen takes positively, the narrator yanks the rug out from under the audience, telling us that, but one thing is certain now, knowledge was concealed from their prophets, and delusive omens were presented to their diviners, and fortune had hardened their senses, and pride deceived their understandings. As the omens abandon Owen, the narrative perspective starts to shift towards Con. Con's mercy and restraint now become the focus of discussion. When the Ulstermen rebel against him, he defeats them, but abstains from plundering their land or harming non-combatants. We hear that as he proceeds to retake Tara, he left every cow in its cow keep, every captive on his path, and every woman with her own family. The other world also seems to swap to Con's side at this point in the tale. Con's friends from the Tuatha De Danann appear to reassure him, and three named otherworldly women recite poems encouraging him to defeat Owen. The supernatural portents that occur at Con's birth are only now recounted, although they're attested elsewhere in medieval Irish literature. But we only see them now, over halfway through the tale, despite the fact that Con has been an adult ruler and a side character in the text for the entirety so far. By contrast, Owen's otherworldly lover Adine, who rescues him in the first half of the text, does not appear again, even when Owen is in dire straits later on. In contrast to Owen's unwillingness to fight in the first half of the tale, now it is Con who looks for a peaceful solution. Against the better judgment of his councillors, he offers Owen very generous terms, including the rule of almost all of Ireland besides Tara. Owen refuses the terms because they do not include Tara with its symbolic claim to the high kingship. His behaviour is even described as proud in one of the manuscripts, edited by O'Curry. What's more, Owen executes Con's messengers when they come to offer the truce, despite their noble lineage. And in the manuscript edited by Curry from Royal Irish Academy 23L26, against the protests of his own household and allies. At this point in the tale, both Con and the narrator seem to decide that Owen is irredeemable, and the titular battle becomes inevitable. Once again, the other world clearly sides with Con. His armor includes clothing from Tir Tungara, the land of promise. The three named otherworldly women who encouraged Con earlier in the tale now appear to Owen and his warriors and prophesy their death in battle. They have, in effect, accomplished the same sort of confusion that Adine inflicted on Owen's enemies to help him escape earlier in the text. The three otherworldly women rejoin Con and again encourage him to do battle, promising him that the sovereignty of Ireland is fluttering just over his head. Gall MacMorna rejects Con's plan to attack at night as dishonourable, and they wait until early morning to do battle, although they still catch most of Owen's host unprepared. The battle begins. Owen duels most of Con's champions, including Gall, once again. Finally, Owen and Con duel each other, both fall, and the remaining kings of Ireland stab Owen with their spears in revenge. Gall admits that Owen died heroically, and Owen's Spaniards flee from Ireland. Con, it turns out, has survived his injuries, and he leaves Conor and Macnaid as joint rulers of Munster. The text ends here in Curry's edition, but Jackson includes a final poem preserved in a few manuscripts in which the events of the battle are reported to Owen's grieving mother. As will hopefully now be apparent, Cá Magdalena is a long and complicated narrative with many twists and turns. None of the characters are entirely reprehensible or praiseworthy, and both Owen and Con have their share of faults and triumphs. However, the moral high ground that Owen has generally held in the first half of the text abruptly gives way to Con's moral and military superiority in the second half. Erich Poppe has observed that, quote, in native medieval Irish narrative, the narrator is in general fairly unintrusive, unquote. While Cá Magdalena contains a few examples of meta-narration that might be considered actively intrusive, this sudden and structural shift halfway through the narrative in narrative sympathy is surely an example of narrative intrusion. It is both unexpected and subversive. The audience's allegiance to Owen, built up by the text's focus on him and his virtue in the first half of the tale, is undermined in a matter of lines, and the reader is left uncertain where to put their sympathies. However, upon closer examination, this narratorial shift is carefully constructed and must be intentional. I think here we are dealing with a cohesive and intentional narrative rather than an incompetent attempt to compile two or more very different source texts. Various episodes and motifs parallel each other between the two halves of the text. Owen fights a duel with Gall MacMorna in the first and in the second half. In the first half, Gall kills Owen's father, and Owen must flee from Gall's further attacks. In the second half, Owen and Gall again fight a climactic duel. The attempts of Owen and the Druid to prevent war between Macnaid and Con in the first half of the text are mirrored darkly by Owen's warmongering in the second half, when he breaks Con's truce and precludes all possibility of peaceful resolution by killing Con's messengers. Owen's unique otherworldly help in the first half of the tale vanishes in the second, where it is Con who suddenly has the otherworldly supporters. While Con has plenty of links to the otherworld in other Old and Middle Irish narratives, there is no precedent in the surviving tradition for Owen's lover Adine, outside of Cá Magdalena, suggesting that it, like most of the second half of the text, was the intentional creation of the author, and that Adine and the three otherworldly women who assist Con were meant to act as foils for one another. Even Con's extensive arming scene in the second half of the tale and his otherworldly clothing from the land of promise recall the marvelous multicolored cloak made from the wool of a fabulous fish that Owen is gifted by his Spanish wife in the first half of the tale. Cá Magdalena is a balanced and intricate text. Episodes in the second half continuously evoke those in the first. as Owen and Con's lives parallel each other to tragically different ends. I want to suggest that we may also have a loose reflection of the Norman invasion in the events of the tale. Owen is ousted from the rulership of Munster by a combination of the High King, Con, and of local dynasties that resent his overkingship. He flees to another country across the sea and forms an alliance with a foreign ruler by marrying his daughter. Owen takes back his lands with the help of foreign mercenaries and strikes a deal with the High King. Owen later worries that his foreign troops are the only thing keeping Con from reneging on their truce. He stirs up further conflict in order to keep the Spanish troops in Ireland and eventually challenges Con, and will accept no terms that do not include the symbolically important kingship of Tara, often associated with the High Kingship of Ireland in Irish literature, if not in historical reality. This whole sequence of events could be very loosely compared with the career of Diarmid MacMurchada, King of Leinster, and his Norman allies. Diarmid MacMurchada, too, was deposed by an alliance of the High King of Ireland at the time, Rory O'Concover, and rebellious local rulers. Somewhat unusually for an Irish king in the 12th century, he fled to Britain instead of to another Irish kingdom, where he recruited aid from Henry II and allied with Richard Fitzgilbert de Clare, better known as Strongbow, by promising him his daughter Aoife in marriage. MacMurchada returned to Ireland, compelled a truce with Rory O'Concover, regained his lands in Leinster, and rewarded his Norman allies with lands in Ireland. It is debatable whether MacMurchada intended to try for the High Kingship himself with Norman support, because he died before he had a chance to do so, although Gerald of Wales certainly thought this was the plan. MacMurchada's foreign allies were certainly a cause for anxiety, although perhaps in different ways from Owen's Spaniards. While Owen worries that his Spanish troops will go home, leaving him in the lurch, Norman lords like Strongbow were reticent to leave Ireland once they had acquired lands and titles there. It should be remembered again that in other branches of this tradition, Owen and his family are themselves the foreigners who have come to Ireland from Spain, and that this mirrors the pseudo-historical material of the migration of the Milesians from Spain to Ireland in Lever Gabála. This may indicate some residual concern with foreign soldiers claiming lands in Ireland, rather than returning home, hidden just under the surface of the narrative. The parallels between Con Magdalena and Diarmid MacMurchada and the Norman invasion are certainly not exact, but it is worth wondering whether the author or authors of Con Magdalena at the very least remodeled existing traditions with these historical events in mind, or intended to comment on historical events by drawing narrative parallels. Con Magdalena seems to be unique among Owenach material in emphasizing the anxiety that both Owen and Con feel over the foreign mercenaries, to the point where this anxiety gives the impetus for truce breaking and for the titular battle. Likewise, the deeply anachronistic for a 2nd century tale use of Dublin as the site for reopening hostilities may reflect real concerns about Dublin as capital of the Norman lordship of Ireland in the later 12th and 13th centuries. This is not to say that Con Magdalena unilaterally condemns Owen as an analogue for Diarmid MacMurchada, or any Irish lords involved in the Norman conquest. After all, Owen is clearly the protagonist in the first half of the tale, and even after his fall from grace, he still dies heroically. Perhaps crucially, he does not actually introduce any foreign powers to Ireland permanently, in this tale at least. However, resonances remain, and Owen's striking moral and political decline in the second half of the text may reflect a desire to rewrite or comment upon the arrival of the Normans in Ireland. At the same time, if narrative parallels to the Normans were intentional, the Norman conquest and resulting political upheaval are here subsumed within a narrative deeply rooted in the distant Irish past and an Irish genealogy and identity. This past, we might imagine, provides a way to talk about contemporaneous events in an elliptical way. If Jackson is correct in attributing Con Magdalena to an author working for the McCarthy or Sullivan families in southern Kerry and West Cork, then the tale was produced in an area that was often at odds with Norman neighbours in Desmond over the centuries following the invasion. It's also worth pointing out that the Owenacht trace their descent from both Owen More and from Con via their shared grandson. So even if one character in the tale is presented as better or worse than the other, both served as apical ancestors for contemporary Irish families in the 13th and 14th centuries. Well, the links to Hiberno-Norman history that I have proposed in the case of Caergrawnt here are definitely tentative. In the second half of my talk, I will turn to a work that is explicitly about historical conflicts between the O'Briens of County Clare and the Normans in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. This is the 14th century tale Caergrawnt, about a series of military engagements fought by Torlvach O'Brien and his descendants against the Hiberno-Norman de Clare family, together with the satellite branch of the O'Brien dynasty, in Munster from 1276 to 1318. As I will argue here, Caergrawnt uses allusions to the Middle Irish adaptation of Lucan's Civil War, in Caergrawnt, the Civil War, both to mediate and at times to intensify the civil crisis it depicts. In Caergrawnt is an anonymous text dating from the 12th or early 13th century, and we know very little about the circumstances of its composition. By contrast, we know that Caergrawnt was written by Sean McCrory McGrath, who belonged to a family of historians closely associated with both the O'Briens and the Augustinian Foundation at Clare Abbey. It is generally accepted that Caergrawnt draws significantly on Inca Caergrawnt, among other earlier medieval Irish texts, for military depictions and literary allusions. The author is not subtle about his use of Inca Caergrawnt. At one point, Caergrawnt explicitly refers to its central conflict as Argath Caergrawnt, our civil war. One of the warriors fighting for Torlvach O'Brien's son against his enemies is compared to Sceva battling against Pompey's forces at Dyrrhachium. Cato is mentioned shortly thereafter in a lament on said warrior's death. Beyond these brief correspondences, however, the full extent to which Caergrawnt draws on Inca Caergrawnt and its author's reasons for doing so remain to be probed. Today, I'm going to examine 3 specific scenes in the text, which feature supernatural female figures. In the first instance, the personification of the sovereignty of Ireland, and in the second and third instances, 2 Bolviv, or battle spirits. I argue that these episodes draw on similar scenes and supernatural figures in Inca Caergrawnt. The otherworldly episodes are striking in a text that otherwise depicts somewhat dramatized historical events, which took place within a lifetime of its composition. In this regard, however, it is not unlike Lucan's original Bellum Cavile, which recalls events just barely beyond living memory, with poetic flair and the occasional supernatural device. The first supernatural woman who appears in Caergrawnt declares herself to be the sovereignty of Ireland, the Flathish Éireann. She accosts Torlvach and his army as they are making their way home from campaigns outside of Munster in 1304, directly after they have plundered several churches. She tells Torlvach that had he continued his campaigning instead of turning home, he would have become High King of Ireland. However, the High Kingship is now beyond him, and she laments losing him as her metaphorical lover. This episode most obviously plays on scenes in earlier medieval literature, in which a beautiful woman representing the sovereignty of Ireland offers kingship to a man who has been deemed worthy through correct lineage and proper conduct. However, it also bears striking descriptive, structural, and thematic similarities to the episode in Lucan, and its first translation, in which Roma personified appears to Caesar as he is about to cross the Rubicon. It may not be coincidental that sovereignty appears to Torlvach at Loch Derg, Red Lake, while Roma confronts Caesar at the equally red Rubicon. Sovereignty in Caergrawnt is described as follows in the quote on the slide here. Many of these are positive descriptions. Several of these details seem to draw primarily from the description in Inca Caergrawnt of Roma, rather than directly from Lucan. Sovereignty in Caergrawnt is described as Ingnathach, extraordinary or unusual, while Roma is similarly Ignach. Sovereignty, like Roma, is described as fair of form to a greater extent than Roma is in Lucan, where she merely has a shining face in the darkness. At the same time, the description of sovereignty in Caergrawnt is subtly disquieting. Literally, in Irish, she has belchraverg, blood-red lips. We might compare the description of battle spirits as bodhov bilgerg, red-lipped bodhov, in many works of Irish literature, including later in Caergrawnt. Sovereignty's hands are bascarmach, which can be rendered as tapering or as sharp and pointed. Her hair is bach camlag, literally twisted or crooked, much like Roma's dishevelled hair in Caergrawnt and in Lucan, as well as the hair of numerous battle spirits throughout Irish literature, including those that appear in Caergrawnt itself, and of the necromancer Erictho in Caergrawnt. The cloak that sovereignty wears in Caergrawnt is brad nuavon, a new brown cloak. But in medieval Irish literature more broadly, otherworldly figures are usually distinguished by their colorful clothing, rather than by mundane colors like dawn, which instead, in the Electric Dictionary of the Irish Language, is usually associated with citations referring to clay, leather, or sometimes dried blood. Her garment then may not be a new brown cloak at all, but especially that it's listed, since it is listed directly before her blood-red lips, a cloak newly stained brown, perhaps with blood. The polysemy of many of the Irish terms used to describe sovereignty here allows her to be beautiful and desirable, but also horrifying and all-consuming upon a closer reading, reminding the audience that the cost of sovereignty is often violence, and linking her to the battle spirits who appear later in the text. Crucially, both sovereignty's appearance in Caergrawnt and Roma's in Caergrawnt are episodes which feature failed acquisitions of sovereignty. While Roma begs Caesar not to bring his armies home to engage in civil war, sovereignty tells Torlvach that by bringing his forces home, instead of campaigning further afield, he has lost his chance at the high kingship. Caesar eventually defeats Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, but he does not remain dictator in Rome for very long before he is assassinated. Torlvach makes a better end, but he does not restore the high kingship, and after speaking her piece, sovereignty floats away into the clouds, literally out of reach. While sovereignty's appearance seemingly validates Torlvach's achievements, likening him to a hero of earlier medieval literature, once again, closer reading and comparison to the analogous parts of Caergrawnt and Lucan subtly undermine the scene. The final two supernatural women are unambiguously disturbing. They are described as baldov, a term which is often used for the Furies in Irish translations of classical epic, and as omocha, a negatively charged term for supernatural woman or witch, which is also frequently applied to the necromancer Erictho in Caergrawnt. Both baldov also play on the washer at the ford motif found in earlier medieval Irish literature, such as Torn Vaculnia, which features an otherworldly woman washing the weapons and armor of those who are about to die in battle. The first baldov appears shortly before the Battle of Lugrask in 1317. Don't read all of the words on the slide. There are a lot of them. They're mostly here to indicate the extent to which you have incredibly dense prose with lots of alliterated compound adjectives. I didn't try to get them to alliterate in English. You can be grateful. So here we have skipped forward a generation from Torlvach, who meets the sovereignty of Ireland in the last example, and now it is his heir Murchtoch, who is opposed by his cousin Donnacha O'Brien and the Declares. The baldov appears to Donnacha and warns him of his impending demise. She is washing limbs and armor when he meets her, and she says that she is a member of the Tuatha Dé, the otherworldly beings of Irish literature. She prophesies destruction, and like sovereignty earlier in the text, floats away into the air. Her description is extensive and physically grotesque. It is also perhaps sexually charged, with particular focus on her naked body, especially her breasts and buttocks. Donnacha responds to this latent sexuality and dismisses her by saying that she is nothing but a baldov lover to Clan Torlvach O'Brien. The second Bother appears to Richard de Clare shortly before his death in 1318 at the Battle of Day. Again, don't read all of these, but here's an example from the Irish to show you how dense this prose structure is. All of these alliterative adjectives are hanging off of just one noun, your Bother here. This Bother states that she frequents the Shitha and Chira, the sheath mounds of the land, but is originally de Truth Efern, from Hell's people. She warns de Clare that he too will join her in Hell. While the first Bother received a hyperbolic and improbable physical description, the description of the second Bother verges upon surreal and stretches the syntax of Irish, piling on an astounding approximately 90 alliterating compound adjectives. Alliterative adjectives are commonplace in Middle and early modern Irish rhetorical prose style, but this passage far surpasses anything in the rest of the corpus in length and density. I want to suggest here that some of these dense alliterative compound adjectives also mirror the descriptions we see of the necromancer Eryctho in the Irish version of Lucan. I should specify that virtually none of the physical description of Eryctho that I have highlighted here in the Irish translation of Lucan appears in the Latin original. So it seems that much like sovereignty in Roma, Caergrawnt is drawing from Inca Caherda directly rather than from Lucan in Latin. Like Eryctho, the Bother in Caergrawnt appear before a battle to give a prophecy of its dire outcome to those who will lose the conflict. Much like in Lucan, how Pompey's son, Sextus Pompeius, encounters the necromancer and asks her to raise a soul from Hades to prophesy the outcome of the Battle of Pharsalus. In Caergrawnt, the second Bother explicitly invites Richard de Clare to hell, saying that soon they will share one country. Much as the ghost that Eryctho raises to prophecy relates how Pluto is preparing hell for its new occupants. The Bother in Caergrawnt and Eryctho in Inca Caherda create dramatic tension within the narrative, as both the audience and the characters within the text know what is going to happen in the impending battle, but are unwilling or unable to stop it. This is a particularly pronounced tension in these texts because in addition to knowing narratively what is about to happen, the audience of both Caergrawnt and Lucan, of course, also knew historically what had happened. The supernatural prophecies in the texts thus double the tension produced by the audience's real-world knowledge of events. Sean McCrory-McGrath approached his narrative of civil war through references to classical and earlier medieval Irish literature. As the conscious and at times self-referential use of Inca Caherda throughout Caergrawnt makes clear, we should conceptualize this conflict as a civil war, even if the foreign origins of the Anglo-Norman declares are also frequently mentioned. Throughout Caergrawnt, the allusions to Inca Caherda align Clan Thorlwig with Caesar, while the other branch of the O'Briens and the declares are aligned with Pompey. Lachlan O'Day, fighting for Murchach O'Brien, is compared to Sceva fighting for Caesar. Sovereignty appears to Torlvach, just as Roma appears to Caesar. The Bother prophecy to Donogh O'Brien and Richard de Clare, just as Eryctho is consulted by Sextus Pompeius. While in Lucan's Bellum Coele, and in some extent in Inca Caherda, Caesar is a far more morally questionable character than Pompey. This did not stop Sean McCrory-McGrath from aligning his preferred faction with Caesar. This may be because Caesar ultimately defeats Pompey, just as Clan Thorlwig maintains their hold over the family power struggle and drives the declares from Ireland, or because Caesar's medieval reputation was somewhat less contentious. Of course, neither Lucan nor Inca Caherda present a black and white view of the primary combatants, just as Lucan portrays both Caesar and Pompey as by turns reprehensible and sympathetic, so too Caergrawnt extends a decent amount of sympathy to the other branch of the O'Briens, if less so to the declares. The use of classical, as well as older Irish literature, allows Sean McRory McGrath to project very real recent trauma onto the distant past. He achieves this in part by using the otherworldly tropes known from Irish literature and Lucan's classical supernatural. The three supernatural women in Carm Thortelwig punctuate the text, situating its conflict within a long literary pedigree and within world history. Like Roma and Erectho in Lucan and in Caergrawnt, they also serve to destabilize the otherwise historical setting of the narrative. Magdalena and Carm Thortelwig were probably produced within about a century of one another, although they are set at very different times in Irish history. Both texts draw on existing Irish literature, but where Magdalena remodels genealogical traditions within striking new narrative structures, Carm Thortelwig takes narrative and structural cues from the Middle Irish adaptation of Lucan. Both texts display anxiety over foreign invasion and walk a fine line between depicting their central conflicts as invasions or as civil wars. Carm Thortelwig is explicitly about conflicts between the de Clare family and the O'Briens, while Magdalena may obliquely allude to the Norman invasion. Both texts also seem preoccupied with exploring and cementing the identity of noble Irish families based in Munster against a changing political background. We could go further and ask whether these texts are related. Linguistic dating of Magdalena is dependent on further manuscript analysis, so any conclusions for the moment can only be preliminary. We do see some parallel phraseology between the descriptions of the three otherworldly women who side with Con in Magdalena and with the Báilimh in Carm Thortelwig and Erectho in Caergrawnt. These vary a little bit between the Group 1 and Group 2 manuscripts, but if you look especially at the bottom here of the slide, our last example, we have a prolonged alliterative collocation here with compound adjectives found in both Magdalena and Carm Thortelwig. Perhaps, however, it is safest for the moment to close by observing the broad thematic similarities between the texts I have discussed today. Even if there is no direct link between Magdalena and Carm Thortelwig, they were probably produced within overlapping cultural circles in Munster in the 13th and 14th centuries. Both texts were interested in identity, invasion, and war, some of it civil. They both appear to encode recent political developments within the narratives and structural devices of older texts and traditions, although admittedly much more transparently in the case of Carm Thortelwig. At the same time, both experiment with new and extreme stylistic choices. The narratorial voice of Magdalena boldly switches sides halfway through the text, in a narrative twist unprecedented in earlier Irish literature. Carm Thortelwig goes further than any other Middle Irish or early modern Irish prose text by delivering a staggering 90 alliterating adjectives in a single run to describe the second Báilimh, bursting the bounds of rhetoric and interpretive sense. The 13th and 14th centuries in Ireland were not merely a time of compilation or retelling existing material, as has often been thought, nor an unbridgeable gulf as literary production was shaken by reform and by the Normans and shifted into secular households. It was also a time of literary innovation and of dramatic stylistic extremes. Jilk and Vour.